Hello, everyone. My name is Puddy, and welcome to what I believe I'm going to be calling a podcast editorial. As to why I'm calling it that, well, I think we'll get onto that in a little bit. Before we get started, I should probably instantly address the microphone quality today, because it's likely to be lower. It could be higher, who knows. My Blue Yeti might be shit, and I don't know. I'm recording off of my phone. I've done this before, I think, but it was not for a more audio-focused show like this. It was for a gameplay thing. It was a while ago. I didn't record off a phone either. I recorded off of a flip camera. Not sure if anybody remembers those. My flip camera is interesting. I think I used my flip camera for a very long time to record my backyard fed. But I can't remember. No, actually, now I think about it, no, I think we used a weird webcam setup the first season, and we had the flip camera for season 2 and like the tour we did. So yeah, whatever. But the flip camera, the audio was not very good. It was like 2008 or 9 or 10 or whatever it was, and it was a novel concept to me to have a affordable, reasonable quality camera that was portable, and I went for a flip camera. But now I'm using my phone. I'm using my phone because I'm on the go. I've traveled a lot this week, and I kind of wanted to put together some content, maybe do some stuff. I also had some thoughts while I was traveling today about wrestling, and I thought I'd put them down on recording. I'm in my hotel right now, I like this hotel. It's a very nice hotel. Hopefully nobody's bothered by the random child in the next room rambling on about professional wrestling. But just wanted to address the mic quality. You might not be hearing this. I might have listened to this and thought, it's too shit a quality to upload. Let me try and put the mic closer to my face. But perhaps it's okay. I thought it might provide an intimate sound. I know my phone is not actually too bad at recording audio. Audio. So I wanted another thing I wanted to address before we get on to the actual content of the video or the podcast today. I thought I would quickly address why I'm calling this podcast editorial. It's probably a good thing to do, right? As rambly as ever, as I tend to be. So the reason why I'm calling it that is mainly because I want episode 50 to be something special. I could make it into some extravaganza, promise to make it great again, and spend months and months never doing it. Or I could do what I'm planning on doing on Sunday, or probably Monday, honestly. And that's just do a special show. Although, there's a part of me that wants to make episode 50 not entirely wrestling related. But Sunday's a really big day for professional wrestling, so it would make a little bit of sense to do a podcast that day. I'm also traveling on Sunday, though, so I don't know. And this might not be out by then, I don't know. What's probably going to end up happening, by the way, the reason why this is called an editorial right now is if I don't do many more podcast editorials like this, then I may make this episode 51 and just move on from there. So if you're looking at the title, and the title is right now in the year 2017, podcast episode 51, you know why it was originally called an editorial. I'm very sorry for this waste of time. Another reason why I'm calling it an editorial is because I like the word. I think it's cool. It's fun. I'm not able to mute my microphone, so I'm about to cough, and I very much apologize for it. So I tried to face away from the microphone when I did. So yeah, I think I might be able to mute the microphone, but F it. I just want to leave my phone next to me as I lie comfortable in a giant bed and talk about programs. So another thing I want to address before we get into like the storytelling aspect of this commentary, and trust me, when we get into it, I think it'll read like a story, is some issues with even discussing this topic. So I'm gonna to outline the topic we're gonna talk about today is why I think NXT has, as a product, declined steadily over the last 2 years and rapidly over the last 6 months, and how, in a microcosm, it very much resembles the downfall of Ring of Honor, a promotion that I adored for a couple of years. Still think a certain period of Ring of Honor is one of the best periods in professional wrestling history, and this year is a very good contender for the worst company of the year. anywhere in the world because of the way it does its product. Although, to be fair, the way it does its business, at least on a professional level, it seems to be a lot more adequate than something like TNA or AAA. Although it could still be argued that they fail from a business perspective because of some other things, but that's probably a story for another day. I think the comparison is apt, but there is something that I'd like to address before we get into it, and that's a point I often see brought up by people, and I've been talking about NXT for 2 years now, on a critical level. I've been discussing its quality and critiquing its merits. It's been a product in very high esteem for me. Or not esteem, but in the limelight for me. It's been in my rotation, as I like to say, for 2 years or so. And, I took a bit of a break this year, but it's been, it's a very consistently in my focus product. Probably the most consistent over the last 2 years. So I hear this point brought up a lot, and that point is as perhaps a method to preclude discussion about the quality of the product. People will often bring up that it's developmental fed, and it's an absolutely correct point to make. I just think often in the context it's completely irrelevant. I completely understand people who will look at NXT's product and give it a lot of leeway, or give it a lot of breaks, or kind of discount its problems due to the fact that it's a developmental company. However, I as a fan can never take that into account myself when I'm discussing the quality of a product. It's just not something I can do, because even though it's a developmental fed, it very clearly, for me, presented a year or at least 3 months where it was an excellent world-class product capable of delivering a 5-star match. And for that to happen, for that to, be within its capabilities, the fact that it's a developmental fed does not hamper it in that regard. And even if it does, I don't think outside factors should necessarily preclude critique of product quality. So I just like to address that. And, you could disagree, and I think that's fair, but I see fans sometimes, and I do think NXT's role as a developmental company is an interesting discussion. I think it's one worth having, but I just don't think it's worth mixing into product discussions. And I see this happen a lot in discussions. I see business critique find its way into product discussion, and possibly vice versa. Although business critique as a pure art form doesn't tend to be particularly common. I do it on occasion with a few other friends of mine, but I don't know. It's weird when I'll spend hours with some groups talking about what certain numbers mean. I know WWE's quarterly financials, which I believe might be going away, or that might be something else. No, it's Dave Meltzer's attendance figures are going away. But WWE's quarterly financials are often something that a certain group and me would spend hours discussing, and then another group I would just post, oh yeah, shit's bad, and then nobody would give a shit. So it depends on what circles you go into, but certainly I find sometimes that certain groups of fans just kind of bundle everything together into a critique of a company, and that's perfectly fine in a way. I do it sometimes. It's easier. Saying that a product is shit and they don't build business-making stars is definitely something that is easy to say and is a genuine critique of a company. I just feel when you delve as deep as I tend to... One second, there's a light on at the end of my room. See, this is the kind of shit you get with a podcast editorial. It is just a leak from the corridor. Back to the bed. And yes, that's probably not getting cut out. Why? Because I'm not editing this thing. This is an editorial. Clearly there is no editing. That's what editorial means, right? I don't even fucking know what editorial means. What was I talking about? It's an easy and fair thing to say, but when you go as deep into analysing things as we are with NXT, and often everyone does with the WWE, it's incredible how deep of analysis goes into every minuscule detail of the WWE, yet people think certain things are oversaturated when we discuss a potentially genre-changing match in Will Ospreay and Ricochet for longer than 2 days. Yet, of course, they've been concerned with the treatment of mid-carders for 2 or 3 years at a time. Anyway, another topic for another day. But anyway, that's the main precaution before we go into this. Is I'm not going to take into account this developmental company, because I don't think it should be taken into account in product critique. And obviously, if you take into account its developmental company, then the comparison I'm trying to make in this video is nowhere near as apt. Okay, let's move on. So the story starts. A little company called Ring of Honor, which I think opened its doors in about 02, 03, and a lot of turmoil in terms of the business end of that company went on with its first few years with Rob Feinstein and the scandals surrounding him. But that's not neither here nor there. But the main thing, my phone drops from its perch. The main thing that starts ROH's ascent to the top is a particular feud. You may have heard of it, which is Punk and Joe, two big names on the independent scene. Two interesting names, because they their careers are mirrored and interesting in their of themselves. Definitely two people who in 2004 were potential world-class wrestlers. Arguably they both became them, and it's a very good argument to make. But absolutely potentially in 04, putting on sensational matches with each other on tour, and absolutely catapulted what we know as independent wrestling in 2016. Now, I think there's an interesting distinction between independent wrestling and territory wrestling, and I think some people, more knowledgeable than me, for sure, would argue that they're probably the same thing. As someone who knows a very minuscule amount about the territories, I've got to be honest, about territorial wrestling. Real territorial wrestling, anyway. Fictional territorial wrestling, I am all on that. But in terms of real territorial wrestling, I don't know much about it. I can't really tell you much about whether whether what happened post 2004 was in any way akin to the kind of stuff you were getting during the real territory era. But I know that independent wrestling skyrocketed during that feud. It was a feud of fantastic proportions. It's great stuff. Those two are fantastic character workers. That's always been both of their strength, and that's a good thing. And they managed to tell a really cool story with it. So Joe and Punk were putting on excellent matches. I wouldn't say week in, week out, but they were running it around the tour. I think they had also run Punk Cabana around the same time around a tour. They were pulling big houses, reasonably big houses anyway. And definitely the independent scene as we know it kind of cropped up. ROH kind of springed the independent scene. Little local feds were hiring out buildings and hiring, say, Joe and Punk to work a main event there. And that's kind of how the independent scene started. You'd hire a big guy who worked in the premier indie, and you build a show around him. That's kind of how independents work these days. ROH grew. ROH was, at that point, because of all that, the premier indie, the premier independent fed. And that, that kind of thing catapulted them, and the fact that those two were such mega stars for their size and their age even was a big deal. Punk and Joe both left, essentially. They kind of held on for a little bit, but they faded and they left. And the company kind of shifted focus first to Austin Aries, who was, not awful, but he was very much transitional in his spotlight and his focus in the company. And then they eventually started, for a couple of years, as the rest of professional wrestling did, to put the spotlight on Bryan Danielson. The thing about Bryan Danielson that I always talk about, I think is his biggest strength. It's why I think he's the best wrestler of all time. Is for a couple of years there, if you saw Bryan Danielson's name on the card, you knew there was a 4-star match on that show. You knew there was a legitimately great match on that show. It's not something you can talk about for a lot of people. And it's that reason why I think independent attendances skyrocketed. Bryan Danielson did, during those 2 years, what only one other man since has done. And that's add legitimate percentages to independent attendances wherever he goes. He would draw 10, 20% higher crowds for that company than they'd usually get just for being on the card. And again, I attribute it to the fact, because it happened again later, and this supports my theory, so I'll talk about that in a second, that you knew when Danielson was on the card you were getting a legitimately great match. So Danielson in his, I wouldn't say carry era, but in his prime, in his amazing period where he could tell great stories with everyone, and he had matches with Takeshi. He had matches. I think I'm saying that right. Takeshi Marashima, the really good, big, bulky Japanese dude who was ROH champion for a while. That dude. And great matches with him. Great matches with Kenta for a couple of years there. You had a few of the little one, the little indie gems, but the real one that stands out to me, and it's still my favorite Bryan Danielson opponent, is Nigel McGuinness. And whenever I say Nigel, in regards to wrestling, I always now think of Nigel Svensson. So apologies if I ever call Nigel McGuinness Nigel Svensson. I think they're practically the same person, I think. But no, Nigel and Bryan had really great matches, like legitimately great matches, and top class classics there for a little bit. I think it was Pure or United where they had their best match. One of those two shows, I think. No, yeah, it was either Pure, Unified, or I think it was Unified was where they had their best match. I think it was a Pure title versus ROH World title match, and Danielson unified the belts. And obviously you had the Kenta matches and all the rest of it. Anyway, all that to say, a independent upsurge and ROH's reputation as the premier independent, and ROH's reputation as the place to go for world-class wrestling, was built on the back of a world-class professional wrestler. A top-notch professional wrestler who was consistently great. And then what happened? Then Danielson left the scene, and the independents mourned. They were enriched for having his presence, for sure. The independents did not crash when Danielson left, but they did suffer. But people knew what independent wrestling was now. That's one of the cool things about what Danielson and Punk and Joe did. And I'm sure I could put other names in there, but I'm bitter, so I'm not going to put Aries in there. And there's other people as well who, someone like a Chris Daniels who did a lot of great work on the independents. A lot of CZW guys like Homicide and Low-Key, and I don't think Low-Key was actually a CZW guy, but a lot of CZW guys that I also am a little bitter about, although I will give props where it's due that the CZW ROH feud was great. That's something I probably should mention in this story too, but I forget so much about it. I really should go back and watch that stuff, because I know it's good, and I watch the Cage of Death every now and then. I should go back and watch that. But CZW ROH feud was definitely a big part of why that company grew. But unfortunately, we will have to leave that out for today. So, back to about 08, 09, maybe a little later than that, right? Where Danielson left the Indies, and the Indies mourned for a little while. And then ROH, as the premier indie, started building around a new generation of talents. Namely, Tyler Black, Kevin Steen, El Generico, Davey Richards. I think those probably cover the main people that they built their main shit around. And while they were good workers, with the exception of Davey Richards, while they were good workers, they weren't world-class workers. And so instead of ROH being a world-class product, the premier independent, it became a good product. Still the premier independent. So that's what happened to ROH. It switched from using world-class workers at the top to using good workers and Davey Richards. And became, instead of a world-class promotion, a good promotion. Now, what happened when Tyler Black, Kevin Steen, and El Generico left the independent scene? Well, they started kind of building around a new crop of talent in Jay Briscoe, Jay Lethal, and Roderick Strong, I guess, to some extent. But they largely switched and relied on a newly formed alliance with New Japan Pro Wrestling to bring in guys that had been presented to an English audience in January of 2015 by an English broadcasted version of what to many English-speaking fans is one of the best events they've ever seen. This, of course, talking about the Tokyo Dome show in 2015, Wrestle Kingdom 9, and ROH chose to bring in a lot of Japanese talent, and on a lot of their shows, the Japanese talent would come in and they would win. Now, what's the problem with this inherently? And there isn't one. You bring in Japanese guys, people look at the card and say, oh my god, these guys are world class, gonna buy the show. They go to the show, they have a good time. The guys they bought the show to see, go over, all good. What ends up building up a culture of them is that none of the ROH made guys are stars. And there's a lot of problems with that from a business perspective, but from a product perspective, what that means is the bulk majority of what ROH puts out is garbage. Because a lack of stars doesn't just hurt from a business perspective, it hurts from a product perspective. Not having people invested, not being invested in a product is a big deal. And it's hard to become invested in a product, at least at the middle and at the bottom, when all of the mid-card stars, all of the lower-card stars, lose to Japanese workers on pay-per-view. This obviously isn't so much of a problem for the upper end, the main eventers and the like. But it is a problem on the lower end, and sometimes it is a problem for the main event too. That's the problem with ROH right now, and to get a little bit more specific, is that their upper end is Jay Lethal. And then that's kind of it. You know, they don't have any guys other than that have his level of protection. And then it's just Japanese, not Japanese guys specifically, but New Japan guys like the Bucks. And then there are some Japanese guys who just come in and completely devalue. And that's, you know, that's fine on a certain level. But the story that you're telling is that these Japanese workers are better than your guys in kayfabe. And again, that's fine in some respects. But it also leads to a situation where you lack guys that people are invested in, that you can get invested in, because stories are hard to tell when you're always building up another loss to a guy who isn't on TV every week. Again, that was a bit specific, but in general, ROH's problems turned from a good product into a product where they brought in stars made in other places and devalued the stars they made, and that made their weekly television product, and in general, the most of their output, not compelling. That's where ROH's story kind of drops in terms of real facts. I would like to offer a future, vision of the future perhaps, and I think signs have been pointing to it for the last couple of months, if not years. So I'd like to share it with you guys, and that's the next step for ROH is, of course, to build the entire show around the Japanese workers, to become an English and American distributor of a New Japan product. And by that, what I mean is, you know, that the biggest likelihood is that Hiroshi Tanahashi, now not such a important and large part of New Japan's main event scene, would, of course, become ROH World Champion. And that started as a joke, and it still kind of is, but it's starting to become more likely, and I would not be at all surprised. And then with people like Tanahashi, with the title, and we already had Tomohiro Ishii hold the television title this year, you start building around the product, and that'll probably make the product better, because it means the Japanese guys will come in and do more dates. But at that point, you're not making people anymore. You're bringing in people from other promotions where their stories have actually been told, saying, "Hey, look at these guys. Their stories got told in other places. You're supposed to know them." And then, well, of course, a lot of people don't know their stories, and it's just not as compelling as telling stories. So there you go. That's the story. Very brief history, skipping over far too much of Ring of Honor. So, how then does this link back into NXT? Well, now let's tell the story of NXT, shall we? Starting in, I mean, we're going to miss a lot out, and there's a lot of NXT development that could very much go all the way back to 2012 even, or 2011 even. But I'm going to start in 2014, mainly because it's where I started watching the product consistently. NXT was built around, I wouldn't say green performers, but performers who very raw in a lot of ways. And, there were definitely an edge. There's definitely an edge of people that they like raw performers, and that's certainly a thing that is another factor that contributes to NXT's success outside of the way it was booked, is that sometimes having something feel raw, something natural, having a performer not so refined and fine-tuned is much more compelling than something that is fine-tuned. There's definitely points where that's not exactly true. You look at NXT today, look at some of their upper cards that's so fine-tuned and polished, and you look at something like WWE or New Japan, where they've really took a guy and they've made him into a star even without telling stories and making him compelling. It's very interesting to see that. But that doesn't produce a substance product. It's very much a style product, right? Going back to the story of NXT, because this, wouldn't be a podcast without sidetracking, even if it is an editorial. We start in 2014, where they had a collection of very raw performers, and they started to tell stories with them. They also had guys coming down from the main roster, people like Antonio Cesaro at the time, still his first name, I think. People like Tyson Kidd, Justin Gabriel. These are, again, performers that, showed a lot of promise, but nobody had decided to tell any stories with them yet. They had time, though, in NXT. They didn't have investors to please. They didn't have shareholders to please. They don't have an audience to please. They don't need to panic whenever ratings drop by a little bit, or buy rates fall, or Finn Balor's merchandise sales are down 10%. No, they don't need to panic about that. It doesn't matter. NXT's never going to make money. Well, maybe not never, but it's never actually going to make a reasonable amount of money, because the Performance Center just costs far too much. That's just the end, long and short of it. When you look at NXT from a business perspective, as again, look, here I am bringing business into product. But if you look at NXT from a business perspective, it's all about proving that Triple H and the man behind Triple H is a successful business person, because as an actual moneymaker for the company, it doesn't make that. But again, I should focus on product. So let's take business out of it. They got time because they don't have performers that the crowd are dying to see. They don't have performers that the crowd will riot if they don't see. So they can kind of tell the stories they want to tell. The crowd aren't demanding in that regard. So they throw out people like Kidd, and they throw out people like Gabriel, and they throw out people like Cesaro wasn't really there to tell stories, but he was there as a foil to someone like Sami Zayn and Adrian Neville and Bo Dallas. These are people that, they're okay to throw out there and make mainstays of the show and main focuses of the show, because the crowd aren't really going to care, because, they're just there to see NXT. They're not there to see any specific people. And so it became a world-class product based on a feud. That feud was Adrian Neville and Sami Zayn. This was one of the most excellently built professional wrestling feuds ever. It definitely didn't have the output that Punk Joe did, because Punk Joe was on tour. And that's the thing, is you look at NXT and it's a microcosm. It's definitely a microcosm. The story of NXT, I think, takes the same steps as ROH's, but in 2 years rather than 10. That's a big deal to point out. Or 12, I think, is actually the time frame on that. So yeah, it doesn't have the on 6 months, 8 month tour of Punk Joe, but it's got just such a more confined and subtle and storied build That that one match that they had is just one of the best ever. And Punk and Joe have a great match too, but you can also point to 5 or 6 Punk Joe matches that are classics, and and that doesn't devalue their best match by any means. But what I'm saying is that Punk and Joe was very much a night in, night out, let's tell and try and develop a consistent story, whereas Zayn and Neville was a moving story. It started at point A and started at point B. Punk and Joe is the story of 2 people who were interacting with each other. Neville and Zayn was very much character development, which is something you don't see in wrestling a lot. And so it's really, really refreshing to see. It was a sensational match between 2 people who absolutely deserve to finally be at their peaks. So NXT became a world-class product based on a rivalry. And then it was kept a world-class product by a world-class performer. And that world-class performer was, of course, Bayley. Now, there are definitely arguments as to whether she's a world-class performer. I don't think I can entertain any of them these days. With the type of wrestling we've seen from her, to me, she's very clearly one of the best in the world. And she's so utterly compelling. And she's not Danielson by any means, but you do see her against anyone, and you can expect relatively compelling professional wrestling at a competent pace. So, moving on from that then, as we hastily move past 2 potential classic matches. Bayley, 3, the women's matches from last year. I think we should move on to when they moved away from Bayley and Sami and Adrian Neville, and they moved towards people like Finn Balor, people like Kevin Owens, people like Kana, we'll say. Yeah, these 3 workers who were good, but not world class. So once again, a product has moved from focusing around world class workers to focusing around good workers. And the product has changed from world class to good. Now, I don't think that this is all of the story. We're definitely smudging the edges a little bit to get this comparison to be perfect. It's still not even perfect, but we're certainly smudging the edges a little bit. NXT's had some storytelling competency issues that we could also discuss. But again, I think that's a story for another day. I'd like to finish this comparison this afternoon. So to move on, NXT away from its world-class performers, and it still hasn't quite lost its good performers yet, or even one of its world-class performers in Bayley. But it's still clearly not getting the kind of product quality that they once had. Decides to take perhaps the step that ROH took. They brought in a selection of people that were well known to the English-speaking audience. And that was Austin Aries, Eric Young, James Storm, and now Bobby Roode. Samoa Joe could be considered in this, but he was brought in a lot earlier. He's had a story told with him. People like the 4 people I just mentioned were brought in purely to add artificial excitement to the product. And honestly, isn't that what New Japan guys do with ROH? They're brought in to bring some sort of artificial, pre-existing excitement. Stories told elsewhere, building some sort of... I want to say like a verb of compelling, but I can't figure it out. But bringing some... Yeah, that's okay. Bringing some sort of compelling element to NXT, just because stories were told elsewhere. And the problem is, of course... That just generally doesn't work from a product perspective. It's a style product, not a substance product. And if you bring somebody in who is purely valuable as to the stories that he told elsewhere, or she told elsewhere, I suppose, then surely the only way to continue that value from a product perspective is to actually tell new stories with them, is to actually evolve them. Evolve reference. I'm not going to talk about them in this video. Well, I should. because they're new premier indie and they're relevant. But what else? It's to evolve them. And if you don't, then and they add almost nothing to the product. It's interesting because it's certainly there is an element you have to balance with the fact that live crowds being interested in the product is incredibly valuable to the quality of the product. Live crowds being interested in it makes the product a lot more enjoyable to watch. And that's why you have to have a balance there, because they can be valuable to bring in and have excite the product up a bit, but again, when you have them win over established NXT guys, you're devaluing them, and you're making the product with them focused on less compelling. If NXT guys are constantly shown to be weaker or not as good in kayfabe to these hot free agents, I suppose, that you're bringing in, then when these hot free agents are gone, in the case of Storm and Young, or when these guys that you brought in aren't evolving, in the case of Aries for sure, and perhaps we're going to see that with Rude. I don't think he's a competent enough performer to evolve. Then the week-to-week product just becomes less compelling. And that's really where NXT ends, in the initial stage of a focus on outside talent. And if I have compelled you to believe the comparison between ROH's development from a world-class product into something that now is turning into a disaster, if you think that the comparison to NXT's development over the last 2 years is in any way apt, you've got to believe that the next step is to focus on that outside talent, is to because they are the most desired. And I don't want to just make this isn't just a TNA thing. The same can be said of Shinsuke Nakamura, definitely so. And if the product starts to move like ROH's, to focusing around those talents on a much more regular basis, bringing people from more people from, because the problem is, as I have now experienced with at least NXT crowds, TNA and New Japan to some extent are the only products with enough English speaking exposure to get people excited about outside talents, because by far one of the biggest names in the Lucha Libre world debuted in NXT a week ago, and the crowd didn't seem to really give a shit. And to put it in perspective, it probably is like Rey Mysterio Jr. coming to WCW. And the NXT crowd were like, meh. So clearly, if La Sombra Jr. can't get a big reaction out of an NXT crowd, then I don't think Mascara Dorada or Rush or Dragon Lee have any chance. And it's similar probably for the lower end of New Japan or any of the other companies like Dragon Gate or All Japan or Noah. There is some sort of water going around me. Lovely ASMR. This could probably double as ASMR in some ways, since I'm speaking at quite a consistently low tone. Alas. If that's the next step, then, I mean, Samoa Joe is the world champion, or the main men's champion, and the main women's champion is a star built very much in another time, in another place. Although, to be fair, with her, they haven't focused anywhere near enough, as much on her outside popularity, because it wouldn't have translated the same way. With her, the translation is natural charisma. That's why I give Shinsuke a little bit of a wider berth too, is that what's getting him over, really, is his unquestionable ability to draw people in and to suck them in and to make them care, as opposed to the guys who have come from TNA, who, in my opinion, and it's definitely a bitter one you should take with a pinch of salt, are getting a reaction purely because they worked for a company that many people saw as a alternative, and it's an and people want to get behind an alternative, and they saw that one as the one to get behind. Alas, I'm not going to be the bearer of bad news here. This could instead be NXT's period of invasion. It could be the period like the CCW invasion where it drastically increases interest and excitement within a product. Or it could be like Evolve's current invasion from the same company. But once again, it's just a compelling product where every match seems to have stakes, and people can seemingly convey a philosophy battle or an invasion angle quite well. So there's things to be excited about in NXT, but I think there are things to be pessimistic about too. For me, I think I'm done with NXT for a while. I don't want to get sucked into a product again that I could enjoy, but is seemingly not lined up with my interests. That's going to be it for the podcast editorial today. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you've thought a little bit about, if you've watched those two companies. I hope you've had a little bit of a thought experiment in your head. I hope you've been guided by my words to think perhaps a little deeper than I have today about ROH and NXT's connections, because I don't think I conveyed my points excellently, but hopefully I've stimulated your mind to think about the question or the comparison on your own. And you probably disagree with me because it's a very weak comparison, but that's what I do. I do bullshit. Prograps. It's all about the bullshit. Thank you for watching or listening, and yeah, I'll see you guys next time. If you enjoy this style, please let me know, because it's very much experimental right now. So yeah, stay classy.